Welcome to our peer learning session on the Collaborative Forest Landscape Restoration Program. My name is Sarah DiVittorio. I'm Director of Conservation Connect for the National Forest Foundation. And we are working in close partnership with the Forest Service on this series of peer learning sessions. This is the third session in a series of 12, and today we'll be exploring adaptive management, focusing in particular on how monitoring informs decision-making. So less on the monitoring component itself and a little bit more on what we do with that information. Jane Mandala with the National Forest Foundation is joining today as our technical lead for the webinar, so please reach out to her if you're having any challenges with the Zoom platform. I have a few introductory slides, and as I go through those, we would love it if you want to introduce yourself in the chat. I see 109 participants on right now, and we would love to know who you are, where you're joining from. And if you're so inclined, you can also let us know your level of experience with this topic. So are you a beginner in adaptive management? Maybe you're an expert, maybe you're somewhere in between. Feel free to share whatever you're comfortable sharing about your experience with adaptive management. So just a few words about the NFF. The National Forest Foundation engages Americans in community-based and national programs that promote the health and public enjoyment of the 193 million acre national forest system. In addition to leading forest conservation and responsible recreation efforts, the NFF also leads and fosters collaborative forest stewardship efforts that create shared conservation solutions. A few housekeeping notes. We are recording today's session. We will be using the chat box for Q&A. So if you haven't located that, you can go ahead and open that chat box, and we will be using that actively today. Following the webinar, all registered participants will receive a link to today's recording, to the speaker presentations, and some follow-up information. You'll also receive a follow-up survey, and your feedback will help us improve this series going forward. So if you can take a few minutes to fill out that follow-up survey, we would really appreciate it. Here's our objectives for today, and as I go through these, I'm also going to kind of preview our agenda. Our first objective is to explore adaptive management examples and concepts, focusing in particular on how monitoring informs decision-making. So we have a bit of a combination of presentations and panelists, a panel through which we'll be exploring these topics. We're actually going to start with a short presentation with some information about how the Forest Service addresses adaptive management. Then we'll move into a section where we'll do some participant engagement. We're going to engage participants to share their own examples of successes and challenges in translating monitoring into decision-making and adaptive management. So we'll do a short Jamboard exercise there. And then lastly, hear experience and perspectives from managers, adaptive management experts, and others. So then we'll move into our panel with folks who are practitioners and experts in adaptive management, and also have opportunity for audience Q&A there. Want to preview today's speakers for you. Joining us from the USDA Forest Service Collaborative Forest Landscape Restoration Program are Bryce Esch and Lindsay Buchanan, and Bryce will be on to provide some context around CFLR and adaptive management. Sarah Weiner is a social scientist with the USDA Forest Service Adaptive Management and Monitoring Analysis. She'll be providing a presentation on monitoring and adaptive management in the Forest Service. Maren Chambers is a research associate with the Colorado Forest Restoration Institute at Colorado State University and is also affiliated with the Uncompahgre Plateau, CFLRP, in Colorado. So Maren will be one of our panelists. And our next two panelists are first Amanda Lindsay, who's a vegetation management staff officer on the Malheur National Forest in Oregon and part of the Southern Blues Collaborative Forest Landscape. And lastly, Jamie Sanderlin is a quantitative ecologist with the Rocky Mountain Research Station, and works with the For Forest Restoration Initiative, which is a collaborative in Arizona. Oh, didn't mean to go to that last slide. So I'm going to stop screen sharing. And with that, I think I can turn it over to Bryce Esch from the CFLR program to provide some opening framing remarks around our conversation.
Thanks so much, Sarah. I'm just going to start sharing my screen here. I'll introduce myself briefly, although that was really comprehensive, Sarah. But hi, everyone. I'm Bryce Esch. I'm the national coordinator for CFLRP out of the Washington office, although based physically in Flagstaff, Arizona. I just want to take a brief moment to put monitoring and adaptive management into the context of CFLRP for you all. And for those of you who are maybe new to the program or new to these sessions, I'll talk a little bit about what CFLRP, the Collaborative Forest Landscape Restoration Program, is. It was authorized by Congress in 2009 to encourage collaborative, science-based restoration on priority landscapes at scale, to support ecological, economic, and social outcomes, leverage local, national, and private resources, facilitate the reduction of wildfire risk, achieve ecological and watershed health objectives, and use restoration byproducts to offset costs and benefit economies. Now, as part of the legislation that established the program, there was a multi-party monitoring requirement that each project must use a multi-party monitoring, evaluation, and accountability process to assess ecological, social, and economic impacts of implementation. And that monitoring process should continue for 15 years after the project implementation starts. So we've been doing multi-party monitoring in CFLRP for over 10 years now. What have we learned? Well, that multi-party monitoring is working. And what we mean by that is there's a tremendous amount of success building and implementing monitoring programs on the ground. Multi-party monitoring has also helped build broad support for these projects. It's created a common language within collaborative groups. It's helped to validate progress and build confidence and trust. And it's helped to support adaptive management, which we're going to hear a lot more about today. Also, based on the first 10 years of multi-monitoring in CFLRP, we've developed and started implementing the Common Monitoring Strategy, which recognizes the successes of CFLRP monitoring, like having that multi-party process at the core of these local efforts, and that there's a lot of success in monitoring at the project scale for these projects, but recognizes the gaps and tries to add consistency by having developed and implementing now a core set of questions. Really, the goal for all this is for the projects to be able to leverage their monitoring results to inform the work that they're doing their implementation on the ground, which is adaptive management. And we'll have our speakers talk to us more about today. And then just to finish up here, I want to share a few resources. First, you can always reach out to me or my colleague, Lindsay Buchanan, or your regional CFLRP coordinator about anything CFLRP, including monitoring. We have a monthly multi-party monitoring call. This is open to everyone. It's the second Thursday of every month, and you can email me to be added to the list. We have a CFLRP public-facing website that has an incredible amount of information on it about all things CFLRP. And then we also have a shared box folder for monitoring resources that's open to partners. And so if that's something you're interested in accessing, you would just need to be added to the list for that. And so feel free to reach out for me about that. So I'll go ahead and stop sharing and hand it back over to you, Sarah. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Bryce. Next, I'd like to welcome our next speaker, Sarah Weiner from the Colorado Forest Restoration Institute.
Hi, everyone. And I am actually with the U.S. Forest Service in the Washington office, and I just want to make sure that you all can see my screen.
I apologize, Sarah.
It's okay. But I assume you guys can see my screen okay.
Looks good.
Yes.
Great, thank you. Yeah, so I am a social scientist in ecosystem management coordination with the Forest Service, and my staff is the adaptive management, monitoring, and analysis staff. And I'm here to talk to you today about adaptive management. So we'll start with just the definition. Adaptive management is a structured cyclical process for resource management decision-making in the face of uncertainty and changing conditions, with feedback from monitoring to actively test assumptions, track relevant conditions over time, and measure management effectiveness. So, we broke this down into a step-by-step framework for the agency. And these steps, I'm going to walk you through a little example as we go through the steps, are to identify your resource objectives. So that's reduce your fuel load in this theoretical example. Assess current conditions. So what is your current fuel load? Develop management strategies. So that could be mechanical thinning and prescribed fire. Develop an implementation plan. It's where and when and how to do that, mechanical thinning and prescribed fire. And then you develop a monitoring plan. This is how you're going to measure your progress towards those resource objectives of reducing your fuel load. And it should be tied to what was measured when assessing your current conditions in that second step. And that's so you can use that information as a baseline and you can track your progress from that baseline. Then once you implement, you collect and analyze your monitoring data, evaluate, report, and determine if there is a need for change. So there you have your adaptive management, easy peasy, right? Well, I'm going to talk a little bit more about adaptive management in the Forest Service and a few different ways that adaptive management can happen. These are not all the ways that adaptive management can happen. Others would perhaps break this down differently. The academic literature tends to describe a more rigorous version, but I wanted to focus on our existing agency processes and how it works in those contexts today. So we'll go over adaptive management and the 2012 planning rule, adaptive management and NEPA, and then some of the informal ways that adaptive management happens. Last, I'll talk about how the CFLRP Common Monitoring Strategy can set us up for adaptive management. And I'll share some insights throughout about, from some of my conversations I've had with our agency leaders and decision makers about challenges that they tend to face when trying to practice adaptive management. Okay, so I'm going to apologize that there's really no way to talk about the 2012 planning rule without it being kind of full of jargon and technical. But we sort of have to go there. So quickly, for the uninitiated, every National Forest and Grassland has a forest plan that sets forth the intention for how that forest or grassland will be managed over the next 15 to 20 years. That process is governed by the 2012 planning rule, which has its own adaptive management process embedded. So it starts with a formal assessment where the unit compiles a bunch of data, assesses current trends, examines past monitoring results, and then identifies if there is a need for change on that landscape. If there is a need for change, they'll either revise their existing plan or write a completely new one, and that new plan will set forth desired conditions and objectives for the plan area. Part of writing that new plan is identifying any uncertainties that should be monitored. And writing a monitoring plan accordingly to measure those uncertainties. Ideally, the items in the monitoring program can be tied back to that data used in that assessment in that first step, so that the assessment can be a baseline against which we can measure our progress. Once that plan is finalized and you start to implement it, monitoring can begin, and the results are reported on every 2 years for the planning rule. And writing those reports, if it's learned that something is out of whack, or the report will identify if there is a need for change, which would trigger you to sort of start that process over, either do more monitoring, do an assessment, and potentially do a plan amendment. Some of the challenges with this adaptively managing through our forest planning process is that I mentioned tying your monitoring to your assessment data. A lot of times the data used in the assessment is sort of a one-off and it's not really available as a monitoring resource. Our plans also tend to last longer than intended. Plan revisions are really rigorous, extended process, and folks aren't always excited to take it on. And so sometimes our plans last longer than they were originally intended to last. And our plan monitoring programs tend to have more monitoring questions than we're able to answer with existing resources. They can be really ambitious. And that can be exacerbated when you have shifting priorities or new things coming down the pipeline. And lastly, it can sometimes be challenging to understand if the cause for concern is due to our management or if there are factors outside of our control. And that's just one of the issues with these complex ecological systems. So NEPA. Adaptive management can be incorporated into NEPA when there is uncertainty about the effects of the proposed management activities, or if there are changing or potentially changing conditions. So you can think about climate change or increasing recreation pressure. For example, say in a project, there is concern that proposed management activities may impact a wild and scenic river. So there's your uncertainty about management impacts. This is exacerbated by the fact that heavy precipitation events are increasing. So there you have changing environmental conditions. Mitigations are planned, in this example, in the NEPA to prevent sedimentation, but there's uncertainty about if those mitigations will be effective. Are they sufficient? So the unit can monitor water quality throughout the project and following that management activity, and they can add more mitigations or change their harvest plan if the water quality is indeed impacted in an unacceptable way. So this type of adaptive management requires really clearly identified desired outcomes. So what are those water quality objectives? And a monitoring plan to determine if those outcomes are being met. It also requires a plan for what changes in management would occur if those water quality thresholds are exceeded. So when used in NEPA, adaptive management provides flexibility to respond to changing environmental conditions and to manage and decrease uncertainty about management activities. Some of the challenges, it can require more upfront work in writing the NEPA documents, and the agency is really focused on streamlining our NEPA processes. Staff turnover, shifting work assignments, those sorts of things can create issues in continuity and follow through. And then funding for monitoring is rarely included in our project dollars. So there's a need to ensure that there really is a plan to get that monitoring done. So I also want to acknowledge that adaptive management happens in many smaller, less formal ways that don't fully fit the definitions and the processes and the steps that I shared earlier. At the end of the day, the goal really is to learn from our management and to constantly apply that learning using whatever tools we have at our disposal. So for example, if a restoration project doesn't quite get the stand to those desired conditions, or doesn't keep it there long enough, those lessons will likely be applied to the next similar restoration project, rather than going back and trying to perfect the prior project. And this way, you can think of adaptively managing a larger landscape than an individual project. Even with this type of adaptive management, there are some of those same challenges, such as staff turnover. When staff leave, those lessons can be lost. And if these things aren't really being, intentionally or properly measured, because we are talking about a more informal process here, we won't necessarily have a perfect understanding of how close or far from our desired conditions we truly are. Especially if there was no baseline data gathered, then it's hard to know what the change truly was. But perhaps through this process, we've identified what we do want to monitor in that next project to empirically reduce that uncertainty going forward. And so it's all part of that longer term agency learning process. So as you may have noticed, monitoring really is the backbone of adaptive management. It's how we track our changing conditions over time and reduce uncertainty to understand if changes in our management do need to happen. A lot of the challenges I listed for adaptive management relate to getting the monitoring done, doing the analysis, and then understanding what those results mean for our management. Excuse me. I could talk for hours about that because the focus of my staff over the last few years really has been on understanding and addressing the challenges with monitoring in the agency so that we can set ourselves up really well for adaptive management. But we don't have hours today, so I won't go down that rabbit hole. So, just generally speaking, some of the things that are important for being successful with monitoring include to focus on your most critical information needs, especially where your uncertainties are. Devise a monitoring plan that's rigorous enough to tell you what you need to do or what you need to know, but not so rigorous that it's unattainable. Monitoring is not research and development. And then funding and committing to follow through with the monitoring are really important to making sure that that monitoring gets done. So I'll just say a few words about adaptive management and CFLRP before closing. I know others might have words to say about this after me. The common monitoring strategy that Bryce touched on a few minutes ago really sets CFLRP up well for practicing adaptive management. It's funded at least for 10 years. It's a funded monitoring program, and it has, vetted and consistent questions and indicators, as well as accountability for reporting. This sets CFLRP up not only to practice adaptive management on individual projects, but also to look across projects to see what's working and not working at a broader scale, and to adaptively manage sort of the program as a whole. So I hope that was informative, not too wonky. I know I spoke a lot about the challenges the agency faces in practicing adaptive management. That's really because my job as a social scientist is to, talk with the field and learn about these challenges, and then work with my team to devise solutions. As an agency, I think we're really still on the path of figuring out the best ways to practice adaptive management within our, bureaucratic and regulatory structures. But I'm hoping that our panelists and others in the room will have some really positive examples to share, because that's how we learn and grow and, kind of build on the successes of others. So thank you again. And I think we have some time for questions.
Yes, we do. Thank you so much, Sarah. And we do have a question in the chat. So the question is, adaptive management promises to respond to changing conditions. How can we, the public, trust that the promises are kept, not manipulated and exploited by those who want to evade protections we achieve? And I'll just note that I think we have time for one or two questions here. So here's one, and if someone else has a question, go ahead and put that in the chat, and we can see if we have time to get to that as well.
So one of the other things that I really like about CFLRP is the focus on multi-party monitoring. And that, I think, by involving others in the monitoring activities, you have shared ownership in the data. You have a shared understanding of the objectives. You have a shared understanding of, what the data are saying and which direction the ecosystem is moving. And, we are trying to, from my position, we are trying to expand the involvement of partners in our monitoring activities for these reasons, and because it tends to, I mentioned staff turnover a few times as a challenge. And I think the continuity that partners can sometimes provide helps the Forest Service manage through some of those staff turnover. I mean, those partnerships are incredibly valuable for those reasons and many other reasons. So I don't know that I answered every part of your question, but I answered the parts that I think I can from my seat in the Washington office, not in an individual National Forest unit.
Great. Thanks, Sarah. One more question before we move on, and this one is, we're currently developing our adaptive management framework here in the Northern Blues. One challenge we have faced is finding quantitative objectives from NEPA or other sources that we can clearly compare. our monitoring data with? Is this a challenge that others are facing?
So I'd be curious, I think that's sort of a question for the audience. I'd be curious what others think, but I would say from my perspective, that is generally a challenge. Part of the reason is that, we have all these very unique ecosystems, and often the ways that we monitor for good reason aren't always consistent across the agency. Again, I mentioned the consistency provided through the CFLRP Common Monitoring Program or Common Monitoring Strategy. I think, those sorts of approaches can help us find consistency. But in my conversations with forest supervisors, I have definitely heard this challenge. And I won't go too far down the rabbit hole of this, but our staff is thinking about this too in different ways that we can, build upon past analyses and help them be useful for many different purposes, such as NEPA and beyond.
Excellent. Thanks, Sarah. I think those questions really previewed nicely some of the themes we want to explore in the panel as well. So for the next 10 minutes or so, we're going to do a participatory exercise with all of you who are on, so that we can hear from folks in the audience about some of your experiences with adaptive management. The goal here is to give you all a few minutes to reflect. Like the rest of us, you're probably moving from one meeting to the other and haven't had a minute to sit down and think about this topic. So just provide some space for reflection, and also to help ground our conversation in your experiences and challenges and questions. So we'll provide a few minutes for reflections, and then we'll try to bring in some of the themes that you identify into our panel conversation that's going to follow this. So the tool we're going to use today for this exercise is called Jamboard. Many of you have probably used it. If not, what I love about Jamboard is it's really simple and easy to use and easy to learn. So I'm sharing my screen right now, but we're also going to put a link in the chat that you can open on your computer and go right to this same screen, and you'll have the ability to edit it as well. And I see folks popping in, so I'm assuming that Jane has put the link in the chat. So the way that Jamboard works, we have two screens set up on this Jamboard and two different questions. The first question is, in your experience, what has enabled effective adaptive management? And then we have a second Jamboard, which is what has been challenging and where could you use more support to do adaptive management? And you can toggle back and forth between these two frames up here on top, just clicking those arrows back and forth. So you can contribute to whichever frame or both frames if you'd like to do that. Please enter your thoughts on these sticky notes that we've already put on here. And the way you do that is pretty simple. You just double click on a sticky note and then you can add your thought. So what has enabled effective management, adaptive management? Maybe you've had good, I think my caps lock are on, line officer support. Maybe that's, something that you want to highlight. And similar on this page, just double click and add your thoughts. If you run out of sticky notes, you can add more with this button here on the left. So I'm going to stop talking and go ahead and turn it over to the audience to start working on the Jamboard, and we'll give probably about 5 minutes for this. We'll check in 5 minutes and see if folks are still adding or if it feels like it's wrapping up. So yeah, so over to the audience to begin working on the Jamboard, unless there's any questions. And I'll keep sharing my screen so that if there's anyone who's not able to access the Jamboard, you can kind of see what's coming up.
So it seems like there might be a limit to how many people can be on the Jamboard at one time. Sarah, would we advise using the chat to contribute?
Yeah, I think that's a good solution. And I was not aware of that limitation. So that's always a learning curve.
And maybe if you've already added to the board with your sticky notes, you could leave the Jamboard and others can vote.
Yeah, and if other folks want to add to the meeting chat, I can try to pop those into a sticky note as well. We have about 1 more minute, and I see a little bit less on this challenging, what are the challenges screen. So if anyone wants to add thoughts there. And doing my best to keep up with the ones that are coming into the chat. I'll keep going on that. Oh, I didn't get that whole thing. Okay, well, this is great. I'm going to ask Jane to keep popping comments that are coming in through the chat onto the board here. I think I caught most of them. I see one blank one, so I may have missed something there. Lots of different themes coming up here, and you know, I don't want to try to take too much time to summarize those now, but would love to maybe turn to Bryce and see, Bryce, you've been observing. Are there any themes that are popping out for you?
Yeah, there are, Sarah. There's a lot around capacity, and I'm seeing that in the, what enables adaptive management and challenges. So things that enable adaptive management are having dedicated staff who are focused on monitoring, and also, strong partner groups that help to accomplish that monitoring on the ground. There's a lot of notes around leadership and how it's really important to enable adaptive management, or in order to enable adaptive management, having open lines of communication and buy-in from leadership, and an understanding of where folks are going with adaptive management, kind of a shared goal. I'm also seeing themes around kind of data and monitoring plans, such as, you really need to have clear goals attached to realistic monitoring plans, and then also having, various sources of baseline data and information, which really makes a lot of sense to me, that having some initial information for folks to look at together as a group would really help kind of build a common understanding of where you might want to try and go with your monitoring and adaptive management. So those were just a few that that popped up for me. There's a lot of really good information here. I just want to thank everybody for their participation.
Yep, absolutely. Thanks everyone for participating in this exercise. And Bryce, that was excellent off the cuff summary. So thank you for that. At this point, I think we will start our panel. So I'd like to welcome today's panelists. We'll bring Sarah Weiner back on screen, as well as Maren Chambers, Amanda Lindsay, and Jamie Sanderlin. The way we're going to work this panel is that I have a list of questions. The panelists will each provide some introductory, comments through those questions. And we'd also love to hear from the audience on questions that you have. So please feel free to go ahead and put questions in the chat, and we'll monitor that and try to bring those into our conversation as well. As I said, we're going to start with a round of introductions. I think Jane is working on spotlighting folks, so they should be showing up on your screen. First question is, please introduce yourself and share your name, title, and landscapes that you've worked on. And then future questions will get a little bit more into, your experience with adaptive management. So this one's pretty short and simple. Name, title, landscapes.
Hey, Sarah, just real quick, you're still sharing your screen.
Oh, thank you for that. Let's start with Maren.
Good morning, all. I'm Maren Chambers. I am a research associate at the Colorado Forest Restoration Institute at Colorado State University. I am most closely affiliated with the Uncompahgre Plateau Collaborative Forest Landscape Restoration Program here in Western Colorado, but have worked on lots of different collaborative efforts all over Colorado. So glad to be here.
We'll have Amanda go next.
Good morning, everybody. Amanda Lindsay. I'm the Vegetation Management Staff Officer for the Malheur National Forest, and that's in John Day, Oregon. And I've worked here for about 15 years now, and I've been highly involved with the Southern Blues Restoration Collaborative. Great.
And Jamie.
Hello, everyone. My name is Jamie Sanderlin, and I am a quantitative ecologist with Rocky Mountain Research Station. It's a part of the research branch of the Forest Service, and I'm based in Flagstaff, Arizona. I've primarily worked with fly. However, I've also worked with data and models with white-headed woodpeckers on 3 other CFLRPs in Oregon and Idaho. Also working on a few more with a multi-regional bird project with the wildfire crisis strategy.
Great. Wonderful to have this group on here today. For the next question, we'd love to have each of you share your experience with adaptive management in forest restoration, both broadly and specifically with CFLRP. So kind of open-ended, but just asking you to describe your experience with adaptive management in these landscapes. And I'm going to go in the same order for this question. We'll start with Maren.
Sure. So I have worked in adaptive management. So the Colorado Forest Restoration Institute is one of 3 institutes that comprise the Southwestern Ecological Restoration Institutes, and our work is to really be a bridge between science and management. So we do work in a lot of collaborative groups. I've worked particularly here in Colorado, but the other two institutes are in New Mexico and Arizona. And so I've seen a lot of different collaborative efforts that all have their own unique landscape, their own unique dynamics, and their own unique approach to monitoring and adaptive management. But most specifically on the Uncompahgre Plateau, that was one of the original CFLRP awarded forests. And so we did a lot of work relating to doing monitoring of forest restoration treatments. And that included actually utilizing a high school internship program to do the monitoring work itself. And then our institute was really involved in the data analysis and reporting for the adaptive management process. So I'm happy to talk more about that, but I think that's about 2 minutes. So
that's perfect. Thanks, Maren. Amanda?
So I've had quite a bit of experience with informal and formal adaptive management on the forest. Informally, I was working as a silviculturist on one of the districts on the Mount here, and looking at vegetation management treatments and how effective they have been, for meeting our goals, and then, making adjustments and adapting as we move to the next project within, adapting like prescriptions and adapting, even how we completed the NEPA and how we analyzed our projects. And then I've had some experience managing agreements and working with researchers for more formal monitoring programs. Some have been, fairly short-lived over just a few years, and some have been longer-lived over the last, course of the last 10 years. So, and that are still continuing.
Great. Thank you. And Jamie?
Right. So I've thinking more broadly with my experience with adaptive management, coming at it with a research perspective. So I'm putting on my research hat. I've been involved with collecting monitoring data to evaluate wildlife responses to management actions. I've been involved with modeling of monitoring data and providing results to decision makers. Also thinking about ways to more efficiently collect and model monitoring data, which is really important when we're thinking about that time scale to decisions. And then more specifically, my role with adaptive management with FORFRY has been a different perspective. So I've been a member of the multi-party monitoring board since 2018 with FORFRY, and I've been involved with discussions of the general process for adaptive management and how to merge information from multiple resources, thinking about different temporal spatial scales and how to package that for decision makers.
Great. What a cool range of experience. The next question is going to start to get a little bit more specific about examples that you all are familiar with. So the question is, can you provide a specific example of when you used adaptive management, i.e. where something you learned fed into a specific adaptation? And this is open to everyone. I can go in the same order, or folks can jump in if they want a minute to think about it first.
I'm happy to start us off. So an example of when we used adaptive management on the Uncompahgre Plateau, CFLRP, was that we were monitoring for both trying to understand the effectiveness of the treatments that were being done in the forested landscapes on that plateau, but also to try to understand longer term ecological impacts. And over the course of maybe 5, 6, 7 years, we started to actually see an influence of the way that we were removing trees and changing a structure and composition of that particular forest, that we were seeing maybe not exactly the impacts that we were hoping for in terms of forest regeneration. So the seedlings that we have on the landscape were not really projecting towards the forest type that we were trying to preserve for long-term resilience. And so when we presented that data to managers and had been talking with them about what potentially could be done, they started to shift some of their future treatments to remove essentially a little bit more of the species that they were concerned with in terms of creating a forest trajectory into the future. And then it started to lead to a lot of other questions about what the future forest trajectories were going to be on that particular landscape, particularly because of drought and fire, as well as the treatments and prescribed burning that had been occurring. So then we actually took that monitoring information, fed it into an adaptive management cycle where it actually changed some management approaches. And then we added additional monitoring to look at regeneration across those treatments. So it was both kind of a twofold. We changed a monitoring approach, but also our management approach.
Great example. Amanda or Jamie want to jump in?
I can go next. So one example that I wanted to share is an example of a fairly informal adaptive management. So with our collaborative, we've had a lot of what we call monitoring field trips, and they have typically been a half-day field trip where we go out to a stand where we've treated, and we look at what did we say we were going to do here? Did we actually accomplish what we planned doing? And if we did, did we get the results that we wanted? Very similar to kind of what Maren was just sharing. Like, are we getting the results that we think we need to have? And one common theme that we found over many years was that we were doing a really good job of reducing density in our stands, but we weren't doing as good of a job of shifting the species composition, and that we were finding that we still had more grand fir than what we had thought we were going to have, ending up after the final treatments, and that we really needed to find a way to kind of get past that threshold that we were seeing. And one thing that we do on the Malheur is most of our commercial treatments now are designation by prescription. And so we have a prescription that goes into the contract, and the loggers, get that prescription, and they get to select the trees that get cut and that get left based on following that prescription. And we'd always built our prescriptions around having a basal area target on our forest. And that was, one of the core pieces to reducing the density, to density management in the stands. And, one thing that we were finding is that despite how we wrote our prescriptions, we were still not meeting the objectives. And it really kind of stemmed to that density target, that whether it was a Forest Service marking crew or a contractor that was selecting the trees, there was always kind of this caution, and there was always kind of this making the stand, I guess, too homogeneous. And so leaving the wrong species at times. And so we had lots of discussions, and on one of our field trips, the idea came up, well, why don't we just not have a density target at all? Why don't we just focus on what's the species composition that needs to be left in the stand? And so we modified prescriptions and modified even our analysis within the NEPA, and have started implementing that. We're not completely done implementing that treatment, and so there's still more monitoring to be done in the future. But just in some of the few stands that I've seen the treatment, we seem to be actually getting closer to the goal that we have for our species composition.
Great, thanks for that example.
So I can jump in with a general status update of where we are with Forefry and how we're thinking about providing information. So we're just getting some post-treatment data on board from vegetation and songbirds, and we are thinking about how to package information from multiple resources to make decisions. But I can't give you that concrete examples like the other two at this point, but it's in progress.
Great. So I'd love to, kind of building off of what we saw on the Jamboard, I'd love to turn a little bit to some of the challenges around adaptive management, staff turnover, loss of institutional knowledge, capacity. I think we're familiar with a lot of those, but wondering if folks can speak kind of from your experience and what have been some of the main challenges that you've come across, and how have you been able to address those or not in your effort? So, and I think for this question and the following ones, I'll ask one or two panelists to respond. We do have a really nice list of questions, so I don't. I think every panelist doesn't need to respond to every question, but want to certainly open up these questions to anyone who wants to jump in. And Jamie, I saw you.
Yeah. Yeah, I would like to jump in. So I wanted to jump in to talk about, from a research perspective, some of the research advancements that I've been involved with different teams that can help with some of those adaptive management challenges. So the first of that is on the statistical side. How do we increase efficiency from raw data to information used on decisions? So that has been in optimizing study designs or different analytical methods, automatic habitat monitoring systems, just some examples, improving inference with some different techniques like data integration, combining information from multiple areas, integrated population models. Like these are all different things that we've tackled to help get at pieces of increased efficiencies so we can get at what the nugget is to answer those objectives faster. And I think I've shared some examples that I think we can share out after the session today.
Thanks, Jamie.
Yeah.
So a couple of the things that I've seen is that, response to the treatments that we do in forested systems can sometimes take a long time to really realize all the benefits. And so, having an adaptive management program that has some longevity to it, especially if you're trying to answer questions that may take 10 or 20 or even longer years to actually realize the full either benefit or the full effect of what you've been doing. So, having some consistency, whether it's internally within the Forest Service or with its, through partners or other organizations that can help, keep that, that monitoring going and to stay focused on, what the original questions were, or at least, have that in the background where we get the longer term data. Another thing that I've seen over the years is that we are using formal adaptive management through research, mirroring what needs to happen with the treatment and how we manage the landscape with the Forest Service, and how to put together a research project has had its challenges because they don't always line up very well. How we need to measure, certain things and answer certain questions might always line up with how we can actually do policy and our rules and regulations actually complete treatments on the ground. And when you get managers and researchers in the same room trying to develop a project, we don't always speak the same language, and so those have posed some challenges over the years.
Yeah, thanks for that. Go ahead, Maren.
I was just going to sort of also articulate that I think staff turnover is such a challenge because you really have a loss of relationship that has been created, and then trust really that's a result of that. And then also the context. And so what I've seen is over the course of even just 5 years, there's so much staff turnover that what ends up happening is that in a collaborative group meeting, you end up actually having to take time to back up and give context. And so you're kind of taking away from that time that you all do have to continue progressing forward with whatever your desired conditions or undesired conditions are, and all of the adaptive management related work that goes along with that. So that's been a really big challenge that I've seen, not only with the Uncompahgre CFLRP, but a lot of the different collaborative efforts that I've been involved in.
Mm-hmm. Great. So there's a great question in the chat about traditional ecological knowledge and how folks have used that in adaptive management work. So I'm going to throw that one out to the group. And Amanda, there was also a specific question for you about, did you include the long-term monitoring in the timber contract, or what was your method there for collecting the monitoring data long-term? So maybe you can address that one in the chat or just quickly on screen, and while folks think about the TEK question.
I can address it, I think, really quickly. So the long-term data, we're not collecting it through any timber contracts. We have an agreement with Oregon State University and with our collaboratives, and it's a third-party monitoring program, and so they're collecting that long-term data. We are just trying to utilize, the results that they are finding through the monitoring program to, to adapt our projects and our contracts to better meet our goals for the future. So it's something that we continually take a look at.
Yeah. Thanks, Amanda. Do one or two folks want to speak to the question around traditional ecological knowledge? And it's pretty open-ended. Just can you discuss efforts to include that perspective in your adaptive management work?
I can share kind of at a high level what that looks like. So our staff is working on a National Forest System monitoring policy, and it really has highlighted traditional ecological knowledge as an important part of deciding what to monitor and how to monitor. And one of the things that I've heard, and speaking particularly with a national forest, leadership from a national forest that does a lot of co-stewardship with tribes, is that the things that you might monitor are going to be different because the priorities and the desired conditions might be different. And so it's not that you are just looking at the same monitoring data and looking at, maybe in a different lens, but what you actually decide to monitor that's kind of where you need to start with integrating the input and I guess priorities of the tribal communities if you are trying to include traditional ecological knowledge.
Yeah, thanks for that. So it really does require thinking about the approach differently and getting those perspectives in early and how you're shaping up what you're monitoring. Other reflections on that question?
I'm happy to just wade into this a little bit. In terms of the Uncompahgre Plateau CFLRP related work, we did not include a lot of traditional ecological or indigenous knowledge in either defining desired conditions or undesired conditions, or in our monitoring or adaptive management approach. There's lots of reasons for that. I think mostly it just was not on, generally speaking, the minds of folks at that time. But one thing I have been seeing increasingly as I'm going to scientific conferences is a huge emphasis on traditional ecological knowledge, and honoring that along with kind of standard Western science and kind of marrying that more and more. And so I think that's been something that's been very intriguing and exciting to see happening more on sort of the broader forest science and management community across the country just in the last couple of years.
Yeah, great. Thanks for that. I want to move to a question about decision makers. This is another key constituency, I guess. I mean, it's probably the wrong way to put it, but a really important audience for adaptive management is the decision makers who are actually going to, make big decisions about their. I'm sort of thinking of it from the perspective of a forest supervisor or someone like that, but folks who want to use this adaptive management loop to make decisions, that are going to affect on the ground management in the future. So wondering how you, what your experiences have been working with decision makers throughout the adaptive management process to get buy-in on either approaches or metrics, or what has that conversation been like when decision makers are actively involved in these processes, and what have been some of the successes and challenges in your experience with that?
I guess I could try to answer that one first. So just from my experience, I've seen when decision makers get involved with the people who are doing the adaptive management, whether it's through their own staff who are out working on the ground and helping to collect the data, or to help maybe make changes so that we manage better, or whether it's through working with the partners and getting to talk to the people who are collecting the monitoring data, or just getting involved. So getting our decision makers out on our field trips so they can see what we're doing and see the ground. Having those conversations with them where we get to share what we're doing. And then one thing that we do on our forest is we have a monitoring symposium. We try to have that every year. And so getting the decision makers to that as well, so they can hear from the researchers, from the data collectors themselves on what they're seeing. Something that I have seen over the years is that the decision makers who do get more involved are typically less risk averse. And they're willing, even though we know maybe making some of the changes that we want to make, there's risk to it, and there may be people who don't support it, and we may get objections or litigation because of it. They're still willing to do it because they see the benefit in it, and that it is actually moving us in the direction that we want to go. So.
Yeah, thanks for that, Amanda. Does anyone else want to reflect on this question around connection to decision makers? I saw Jamie unmute.
Yeah, so we're piloting what's called a conservation design approach, using collaborative sessions to walk through the adaptive management process, defining at each step who the actors are, what the action is, and what the products are expected. We're piloting that in the multi-regional bird project that I mentioned at the start, looking at the wildfire crisis strategy, but also using what we're learning in that process to apply to the FORFRI multi-party monitoring board. And so far it's been, I think, useful in identifying the format of products and when we expect what and what the clear rules are. So that's been really helpful. And I think getting more of that buy-in from folks. So having everyone at the table.
Great. There's a set of questions in our sort of prepared questions around, and I think we're already kind of going here in the conversation, but really around like accountability for adaptive management, or memorializing the lessons of from adaptive management. How are folks ensuring that you're capturing the lessons learned from monitoring and adaptive management, and memorializing what you're learning, and memorializing what decisions are being made based on that adaptive management effort? So wondering if folks can comment on, how you've been involved in efforts that have either done a really good job sort of memorializing lessons and documenting how you're using adaptive management, or where that's been more of a challenge. I think there's always concern when when we're collecting lots of data that it's going to end up on a spreadsheet on someone's computer, or, you know, that isn't sort of more broadly shared or isn't acted upon. So how has that looked in the efforts you've been involved in, and how successful has it been? And, you know, what approaches would you recommend around that? Sort of a big question there, but hopefully someone can make some sense of that.
Okay, I'll try to dig in first. So similar to Amanda, we have put on yearly what we call, instead of a monitoring symposium, a monitoring jam session, where we kind of jam on all of the data that's been collected, the results, and make some meaning of it, and then talk through some of the potential adaptive management strategies. So that was something that was explicitly called out in our funding. There was someone who's identified to actually facilitate that, find the room, create the time, send out all the invitations. So I actually think that role and creating space for that is very, very important. So when we did that, what we would do is have all of the people who were doing monitoring work present the monitoring results and some interpretation about potentially some things that could happen differently in the future. In addition to that, we also, you know, each person would have some kind of actual document that would support that presentation. So it might be just a short monitoring report. It might be a more lengthy monitoring report. And then we, every 5 years, so we're about to do the 15-year in a couple of years when we're done with our post-funding 5-year monitoring, we are essentially going through and kind of memorializing all of the monitoring work that has been done. Now, to your question of accountability in terms of how all of that monitoring has informed changes in management, in terms of an adaptive management cycle, that's where I think, you know, not exclusively to the Uncompahgre Plateau CFLRP, but many of the collaborative groups that I've been involved with that have utilized some kind of adaptive management strategy, that's really when things kind of break down a little bit in terms of actually reporting that, illustrating that, justifying that. That seems to be a little bit more organic and is not necessarily where there's some level of, maybe as you could put it, accountability in terms of we've learned X, Y, and Z from our data collection and you know, analysis and interpretation. So now what do we do differently, and how are we proving that we're doing that differently? I think what I have seen personally and in my small, you know, world here in Colorado is that that's actually one of the harder pieces. And unless there is some clear, you know, indication that that's critical to do, I think that's where it's sort of fallen short. And I totally understand why. Everybody's busy, and that's also a little bit harder to truly illustrate. But I think that that is one lesson that I think would be really valuable to take forward into the future, is to actually illustrate, well, here's what we learned from this particular prescription and all of the data that came from that. Here's what we're going to do differently in a similar landscape, a similar forest type with a similar management approach, and how we're going to try to experiment differently and then learn from that, and then start that whole adaptive management loop over again. So.
Great, love that. Are there other panelists who want to weigh in here? And if not, I can move on. Yeah, Amanda.
I would add just a couple of things, Maren. That was great. That's very similar to what we're doing. Just a few things that we have as well built in on the Southern Blues is, so we have what we call a forest vegetation and fuels monitoring program, and that's some of our long-term monitoring. And we've actually got it built in that the researchers that are collecting that data also provide that data in common stand exam format for us to actually put into our FSVEG database. And so not only do the researchers have their data, but we actually get it solidified in our Forest Service database, and that helps. You know, and then we've built in, you know, room for the researchers to actually write papers so that we have peer-reviewed site-specific science that helps with documenting, the results of our monitoring, but it also is, it's a feedback loop into our next NEPA documents so that we can provide the background and we can provide, the science that says this is the route that we want to go and here are the effects that we're going to have. And then our collaborative has what they call zones of agreement documents. And that's another way to, document that we've spent a lot of time working on some of these areas, and there's been a lot of data collected, and there's a lot of science that supports it. And they're, socially, at least through the collaborative, these are, management techniques and management goals and directions that we want to move forward with. And so those are just some of the ways that we, try to get it documented so that we have the information for the future.
Yeah. Yeah, go ahead, Jamie.
Yeah, just one more thing to add. I think what has been said so far is really spot on. One thing that has come up within the FORFI multi-party monitoring board is within each one of our monitoring reports for each of the resources is having a section that's very clear. What is the monitoring question that this is addressing? What's the metric, and how is what has been done meeting that question? What is the answer? So that it's clearly distilled and has that clear tie-in to what those objectives were at the front, because there's always a lot of additional information that can be learned, but zeroing in on that specific answer.
Great. Couple different directions I could go, so I'm pausing to think what question I want to ask. Amanda started bringing up the collaborative context in which a lot of you all are working. Wonder if there's any other reflections that you all have on the role of monitoring and adaptive management, specifically when you're working in a collaborative where there's lots of different interests and perspectives at the table. Any examples you want to share of where monitoring and adaptive management maybe helped play an important role in how that collaborative decided to work together?
I can jump in here. So I was really surprised one year when I was at our monitoring jam session on the Uncompahgre Plateau CFLRP, and I presented some work on some of our forest floor conditions. So some of our understory, species to the functional level, soil, rock, things like this that I thought was maybe not going to be the most exciting information. And an entire two groups who were interested in some of these kind of more environmental conditions that were public groups came to me after the conversation and essentially said, we're good. We are totally happy with what the Forest Service is doing. This was the biggest concern that we had, was actually that the mechanical machinery was actually going to be churning up a lot more soil and creating a lot of negative soil impacts to this environment. And so your findings have quelled all of our concerns, and we have a lot of trust in part because this data has been collected. It's been analyzed and reported on by a third-party neutral organization that doesn't necessarily have a stake in what they're presenting. And essentially we're like, we no longer have concerns, and we'll still participate in this collaborative process. But we're feeling very assuaged in our concerns, generally speaking, about forest management on the Uncompahgre Plateau. So I think it's just an awesome example of how monitoring can actually help to build trust with multiple organizations, with the public, to help think through that. So.
Great. Any other examples folks want to share?
I have an example. And it's funny how Maren answered that question, because mine is very similar. And we've seen a shift in our collaborative over the years. From when I first started, people were still fairly entrenched in their their resources and in their different perspectives on the forest. And over the years, we have transitioned to, well, we have questions. We don't agree about this. Let's monitor it. Let's put some formal monitoring or some informal monitoring in in the process, so that we can answer these questions and we can really just learn. And it has, like, those types of projects have helped to just build a tremendous amount of trust. And it's really, people have, they're very genuine about, like, let's just learn, let's try something and learn. And, and that's been great. And so one example I have is we had fires several years ago, it was back in 2015 on our forest, that was very large. And at the time was one of the most devastating fires in Oregon, unfortunately. But the group had been talking about salvage logging for a year or two. And, like, should we actually be doing salvage logging, and what are the effects of salvage logging? And there was enough trust built up within the group that, we moved out on a salvage logging project. It was fairly small, relative to the fire, but it was, we were looking at the effects to 3 different woodpecker species. And, through that monitoring, some of the results they're still analyzing some of the results, and we're still waiting on some of the papers to come out. But, just the process of going through that really built a lot of trust, and people have, I think, a bit different perspective on really what are the effects of salvage logging in forests. And so, that's an example where, there's a big question and a controversial question, but people were willing, to come together and say, well, let's monitor this, let's try it, let's monitor it, and let's go from there. So.
Great. Love these examples of sort of the promise of collaboration in informing adaptive management. Those are great examples to hear. I think we have time for maybe one more question. I'm also seeing that there's some chat that Sarah's having in the chat about, sort of rolling these lessons learned up into more national level communications about adaptive management and how that's shaping agency efforts. So Sarah, feel free to jump in if there's anything you want to add on that conversation. I think, yeah, go ahead.
Not much to add, just generally, I think sharing the lessons learned from adaptive management is something that we should absolutely be doing because it helps reduce that uncertainty in other landscapes, and those lessons learned can really inform what other folks are doing, and again, help build that trust.
Yeah, great. So the last question I'm going to throw out there for our panelists is, how are CFLRPs sustaining monitoring over the long term in terms of capacity, funding, and just priority and attention, in the midst of lots of competing issues and priorities? We know that CFLRP provides 10 years of funding, but requires 15 years of monitoring. So, that's a piece of this question too. And just generally, how has this long-term requirement been a challenge for you, and or how have you addressed that and built, a sustaining approach?
I can definitely speak to this because this summer will be our 5th year of the post monitoring funding cycle of monitoring. So we have, it's very robust monitoring for the first 10 years of funding. We had a lot of success actually doing our implementation as well as monitoring. And so we've been very fortunate for that. But I think one of the things that I have seen happen past the funding cycle is the challenge in actually getting funding to support the remaining monitoring. And we, in our particular CFLRP, we're utilizing a high school internship program. I could talk a lot about that. And if anybody has interest in connecting about that, I think it's been something that's been really amazing to build trust with the community after some pretty big conflict, as well as to actually foster the future workforce in that area. But I think that, there's still costs to doing that particular monitoring with a high school internship program. And it's relatively inexpensive, but it has been difficult for the forest to come up with the funding to do that every year, in part because of just competing interests, waning interest in the CFLRP, because there's other big things that have happened, particularly novel disturbances like very large scale beetle impacts and fires. And so that's just one thing that I personally would suggest, is that if there is an opportunity to set aside money during the 10-year funding cycle to bank for 5 years post funding for monitoring, that would be really helpful if that's a possibility. And I think that I've heard that, especially from a lot of agency staff, that wished that we had done a little bit more of that, taking a percentage or two of the overall funding cycle, putting it away for future years would have been really helpful to at least augment some of the costs that were coming up each year. So I'm happy to talk more about that if anybody has particular interest, and can put my email in the chat.
Thanks, Maren. Any other comments or advice around this question of sustaining these efforts? Yeah, Jamie.
Yeah, I'd also have to say that Forefry has been around for a while. And one thing that has helped, and with the capacity and the funding to go forward, is that Forefry has been identified as one of the priority landscapes for the wildfire crisis strategy. Also, it's a regional priority within Forest Service Region 3. So it's keeping an eye on this as important going forward. So that's been helpful. And thinking about all our partners and how to bring different resources and thinking outside the box to keep that monitoring going.
Great. I said that was the last question, but I actually have just one more, and maybe we'll close on this note. I noticed in the chat when we had folks introduce themselves in the beginning, and maybe make a note about their level of experience with adaptive management. We had a lot of folks who said, I'm pretty new to this topic. So I'm wondering if any of our panelists want to offer reflections as we close out on, if there's maybe one thing you wish you'd known when you started embarking on this field of monitoring and adaptive management, or one piece of advice you would give to somebody who's new and just diving in, what would that be? And that's a curveball, so take a minute to reflect, but would love to close out on that note.
I would say don't leave your monitoring to be designed at the last minute as an afterthought, and build in funding to do it and design it with the end goal in mind.
I guess I would say, just from my perspective and the experience that I've had, is don't be afraid to step into it. You will likely challenge some of the thoughts and perceptions that you had about, forest management and what, the goals and the objectives that we have in the Forest Service, but you're going to learn a lot, and you'll actually likely build a lot of relationships as you go through the process. And you'll have to say hi to my little boy.
I want to go outside.
We all want to go outside. Great. Thanks, Amanda and Sarah. Yeah, Maren.
Yeah. So I think I mentioned it. One is, to ensure that there is some level of funding for the post-funding monitoring. I think in my perspective, building in controls would have been very helpful for us. We did not do that for various reasons, and I think that would have been helpful, especially now that we're hitting our 15-year mark. We don't have, kind of reference monitoring to really look back and compare to. That would have been very helpful. And I think the other thing I would say is to really do a good job of trying to articulate your story through notes or monitoring reports. Because of that staff turnover, it just takes a long time to communicate. And then when you do have staff turnover, particularly for those decision makers, it's a really great way to illustrate, here's the investment that we've already made in this in terms of financial, resources, human capacity, so that when someone else new comes in, they can really see how much has been invested, and then that, the interest doesn't wane necessarily so quickly. Those would be kind of the big things that I would suggest. And the other was that Our particular collaborative group was relatively new in the collaborative space quite long ago, and they had a really hard time figuring out what their desired conditions were. And so finally, I think someone had the genius insight to say, why don't we figure out what our undesired conditions are, which was much easier for this larger group of people who had a lot of disagreement to come together to really work on. Because I think they could have spent years just determining what their desired conditions were, and then what their ecological questions were, and then what their monitoring was going to be to support all of that. So.
Yeah, Jamie.
Yeah. So I wanted to also echo a couple of things that I've been hearing, coming from more an academic setting into, in practice, coming in with an open mind. Relationships are key here, and listening to all the different perspectives and finding that common ground. But I think it comes down to those relationships and how we move forward.
Excellent. Well, yeah, I'm really glad I asked that question. I think those were all, really important reflections based in your experience. So I think we can wrap on that note. I want to really just offer our appreciation and thanks to our panelists and speakers today who brought so much of their experience and wisdom to this conversation. And want to also thank everyone in the audience for participating. Really, really appreciate you being here. Appreciate your participation in the Jamboard exercise, despite that little technical hiccup we had there. Just a quick reminder that you're going to receive a follow-up email with a link to today's recording and presentations and contact information. We would also really appreciate if you could give us any feedback through the survey that you'll receive. I think that's all I have. So thanks, everyone. Hope you're looking forward to a wonderful 3-day weekend, and we'll see you next time.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye, everyone.